imagine growing up in ancient Rome and finding the practice of slavery morally abhorrent. Would you feel hopeful that someday slavery would be outlawed and widely condemned? Well, I don't know. I mean, given how widespread slavery was at the time, it would be understandable if opponents of slavery felt pessimistic. Now consider, for example, the following quote from Steven Pinker. For most of the history of civilization, the practice of slavery was the rule rather than the exception. It was upheld in the Hebrew and Christian Bibles and was justified by Plato and Aristotle as a natural institution that was essential to civilized society. So-called democratic Athens in the time of Pericles enslaved 35% of its population, as did the Roman Republic. Slaves have always been a major booty in wartime, and stateless people of all races were vulnerable to capture. The word slave comes from Slav, because, as the dictionary informs us, Slavic peoples were widely captured and enslaved during the Middle Ages. States and armed forces, when they were not used as enslaving devices, were used as enslavement prevention devices. As we are reminded by the lyric, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves." Well before Africans were enslaved by Europeans, they were enslaved by other Africans, as well as by Islamic states in North Africa and the Middle East. In light of how much progress has been made so far, we might wonder, how far will veganism get? And well, I don't know. But let's for one moment imagine a total victory for veganism. A future where all humans stop exploiting animals for food and for clothing and so on. Now, to say that this would be a huge victory would be an understatement, but would the battle be over? I don't think so. Not only would there still be great suffering experienced by animals, but there would be a risk of humans causing animals to suffer more than they do today. And so in this video, we're going to go over 3 ways that humanity, even if we all go vegan, could cause great suffering to animals. Number 1 is the introduction of predators. Now, the introduction of predators is often romanticized. The famous intervention at Yellowstone is considered by many as a success story, and very recently in Colorado, the public voted for the state to reintroduce grey wolves. Now, it's common for conservationists and animal advocates to promote the introduction of predators as a means of population control and in an attempt to restore areas of the world back to its previous, more natural state. But if we're against humans killing animals with rifles, why would we be in favour of humans capturing or breeding wolves and using this method to indirectly rip deer to shreds? How is that any better? Not only are humans killing animals in both cases, but in the case with the wolves, we're causing far more suffering. I know if I was to be born as a wild animal, I would much rather be shot than ripped apart by wolves. And look, that's not to say that I think hunting is ethical, it's just to highlight how terrible predator introduction is. I believe that if you consider yourself non-speciesist, then you shouldn't be promoting the introduction of predators as a means of population size control. And to illustrate my point, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine a tribe of indigenous people who are cut off from the rest of civilization. Now let's further assume that in the past there were bears who would occasionally eat some of the children, keeping the population size in check. But now, due to humans hunting these bears to extinction, the population size of the tribe is getting out of control. Now, how would you feel about reintroducing new bears to hunt down these indigenous people and eat them alive as a means of population control? And if we're not willing to accept this in a human context, why then would we accept it in a non-human context? Is that not a textbook example of speciesism? When wolves are reintroduced, it's not because people thoughtfully try to figure out how to best reduce suffering and conclude that although it is terrible for a deer to be eaten alive, having more of these animals eaten alive somehow decreases suffering overall. This isn't what's happening. And for reasons that I explain in my video about Yellowstone, one might suspect that interventions like these more often than not increase the total amount of suffering. The main reason behind rewilding is a romantic notion of making ecosystems the way they were, because somehow that's natural. If we really cared about the animals that lived there, we would instead be focused on trying to figure out what combined impact our actions have on them as individuals. Valuing things such as biodiversity and things being natural as goals in and of themselves is in some ways comparable to valuing things such as the preservation of culture and traditions and cultural heritage. And look, most of us value these things to some degree. I mean, that's why we want to preserve the pyramids and why we don't want to turn the Eiffel Tower into scrap metal. But if someone argues that because of cultural heritage, legalized slavery should be reintroduced, or rape should be preserved, well, we'd view them as deranged. The wolves that are born in Yellowstone today are born because humans spent a large amount of effort and money capturing wolves and transporting them to a different location. And we went out of our way to do that so that more deer can be eaten alive. But being eaten alive is terrible agony. If we did it to humans, we would call it torture. Because it is torture. Look, if you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy, then why wish it on them? The second way we might spread suffering is by spreading suffering to additional planets. Now, I know this might sound like a premature problem to worry about, but it's possible that one day doing those kinds of things will be possible. And if we don't make a lot of moral progress by that time, I fear we might handle such abilities very irresponsibly. One proposal is the terraforming of Mars. Now, various steps would be taken to make the Red Planet increasingly hospitable to life until plants and animals could be sent to live there. Some people view doing so as an important ethical pursuit for humanity. This view is held by the Panspermia Society. Directed panspermia is the deliberate transportation of microorganisms in space in the hope of introducing life on lifeless but habitable planets. Michael Mortner, research professor of chemistry at Virginia Commonwealth University and advocate of direct panspermia, said, "We have a moral obligation to plan for the propagation of life, and even the transfer of human life to other solar systems which can be transformed via microbial activity, thereby preparing these worlds to develop and sustain complex life." Marshall Savage, author of The Millennial Project, Colonizing the Galaxy in 8 Easy Steps, once said, "Because of us, landscapes of radiation-blasted waste will be miraculously transmuted. Slag will become soil, grass will sprout, flowers will bloom, and forests will spring up in once sterile places. Ice, hard as iron, will melt and trickle into pools where starfish, anemones, and seashells dwell. Because of us, a whole frozen universe will thaw and transmogrify, from howling desolation to blossoming paradise." Now, if what was proposed really would result in us spreading paradise, then I'd be on board. But to put it mildly, that's not what is being proposed. Ecosystems typically contain enormous amounts of hunger, disease, stress, and frustration. And most animals that have children have lots of children, but for population sizes to remain stable, only a few of these children can reproduce themselves. So most are dying very young from starvation, from disease, and from being eaten. People who advocate for filling the universe with ecosystems that are full of suffering, have they themselves spent much time considering what it's like to be swallowed whole and die in the stomach of a larger fish? Have they themselves tried nearly starving themselves to death, or ripping off fleshy bites of their body piece by piece so as to make a more informed stance on whether they wish this fate upon gazillions of animals? I doubt it. People who advocate for this sort of thing think they're doing something morally good, but such efforts, if successful, could end up creating many more times as much suffering as has been experienced by all humans and animals for the entire history of life on Earth. Sometimes philosophers and theologians ponder on the question of evil. Why would a good God create so much needless suffering? But if we, at some point, decide to spread life to other planets and choose to fill these planets with ecosystems that are full of suffering, then the same question could be asked of us. Now, if you think I'm losing touch with reality when I talk about wild animal suffering and space colonization, then, well, you probably won't like the rest of this video either, because the third thing we're going to discuss is also related to speculative technologies. And it reminds us that as our technological capabilities increase, this will increase our ability to do great things. But it will also increase our ability to do terrible things. Let's start by taking a look at this hard drive. It's from 1956, and back then it was state of the art and couldn't be afforded by normal people. But its storage capacity was only 5 megabytes, which would barely be enough to store a few seconds of the YouTube video you are watching right now. Or we could look at this graph, which shows the development of how much computer power we can buy per dollar. Notice that the y-axis here is exponential, so it doesn't go 1, 2, 3. It goes 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million, and so on. If we show the same graph with a linear y-axis, it will look like this. If in the future we get much more computational power than we have today, then we might use that for lots of things. And one of those things is simulations of humans and animals. And by simulations, I don't mean the kind of simulations that you get in games like The Sims or Hunting Simulator. I mean complex simulations that replicate the inner workings of brains and nervous systems. People are already trying to do this. For certain very small animals, simulations that try to mimic the complete neural system have already been run, and there are several large projects whose aim is to simulate either the entire human brain or parts of it. One of the motivations for this among many is that it might help in the understanding of diseases such as Alzheimer's. One challenge in simulating brains is to understand it well enough. And while we are far off from fully understanding the human brain, we are getting better and better tools for studying it and monitoring it on a microscopic level. Another challenge is the computational power that would be required. Now, we don't know how much computational power it would take to simulate the human brain, but we might guess that it would take somewhere between 10 to the power of 13 and 10 to the power of 21 flops. As a comparison, the current most powerful computer in the world has a capacity of roughly 10 to the power of 17 flops. Time will show if the exponential increase in computing power that we have seen in the last decades will continue for many more doublings or if it will dampen off. But among experts who speculate about what's possible, some estimate that it will be possible to get performance that is very extreme compared to what we have today. So while the future is highly uncertain, I would not rule out that perhaps someday in the future, maybe even personal computers could have enough computational power to simulate the human brain, and possibly enough to simulate billions of human brains. In light of such possibilities, we might ask ourselves, if we simulated a brain in sufficient detail, would it be conscious? Well, we don't know for certain. Consciousness is a scientific and philosophical mystery, and experts have wide-ranging guesses as to which entities are capable of consciousness and which aren't. But I think Daniel Dennett said it well. I've been arguing for years that, yes, in principle, it's possible for human consciousness to be realized in a machine. After all, that's what we are. We're robots made of robots made of robots. We're incredibly complex, trillions of moving parts, but they're all non-miraculous robotic parts. As humans, we do at times conclude way too quickly and with way too much certainty that other kinds of minds don't have consciousness. For example, a few centuries ago when the live dissections of dogs was common in certain kinds of research, many of the scientists that did this felt confident that dogs aren't conscious. Like René Descartes, they believed that animals don't have souls and therefore don't have consciousness. Another example of people recklessly assuming that other beings aren't conscious is lobsters. It has been claimed by many that lobsters can't suffer, and many feel safe enough in this assumption to boil them alive, despite the fact that the most recent research suggests that they probably do suffer. There are many different kinds of simulations that might contain extreme suffering. One example could be simulations of ecosystems where the brains of the animals are also simulated in detail. One could imagine simulations being run to understand ecosystems better, or for taking guesses as to different paths evolution could have taken, or for speculating about what aliens might be like, or simply for fun. If simulations of large quantities of brains becomes possible, and if these simulations are conscious, and if people have a lackluster attitude towards what it might be like to find yourself in a simulation, then in such a scenario, we might find that the running of these simulations causes many, many times more suffering than all the suffering that has existed on Earth so far. Facing possibilities like this, it's better to be safe than sorry. So there are three things that we discussed in this video: rewilding, the spreading of ecosystems to other planets, and simulations. Now, the first of these is something we already do today, and which I think probably causes more animal suffering overall. The last two are examples of ways we might increase suffering in the future by enormous amounts. That makes them examples of S-risks. An S-risk is a potential event where the result would be suffering on an astronomical scale. Perhaps I'll make more videos about S-risk in the future. Who knows, perhaps some of the things I described in this video aren't actually realistic scenarios. But if they are, or if they might be, then there is a lot of moral progress that needs to be made between now and the day they become possible. Looking back on history, it's a tragedy that we didn't make moral progress quicker. I mean, think of all that could have been avoided if people were quicker to make realizations such as, oh yeah, we shouldn't be giving people cruel and unusual punishments such as being nailed to crosses or burned at the stake. Oh, perhaps we shouldn't force other human beings to be slaves and treat them as property. Who knew it might be wrong to treat people badly simply because of their sexual orientation? Looking back, these things seem so obvious, and hopefully one day people will look back and wonder why humanity as of 2020 didn't see more easily that of course the torture of animals at farms and slaughterhouses is wrong. If so, we will have one less moral blind spot. But there could still be blind spots left that make us capable of committing atrocities. There is one question in particular that people in the past should have asked themselves more often and taken more seriously. If they did, then they would have made moral progress faster. And this same question, if we become better at asking it, will make us less likely to commit atrocities in the future as well. And it will make us less likely to support things like rewilding, where an intentional consequence is that more deer are eaten alive. It's a simple question, consisting of only 5 words. What if it was me? As always, thanks so much to my patrons who are making these videos possible. If you would like to become a patron, you can do so by clicking the link in the description box. I'm also thankful to anyone who simply hits the subscribe button, and for everyone who shares my videos with their friends. Thank you for doing that. And thanks for watching, and I will speak to you very soon with another video.